These were the years of sovereign default. The king simply stopped paying. But the impact was not just on the bankers. The middle class was obliterated by inflation. A shoemaker in Madrid saw the price of bread triple in his lifetime, while his wages stagnated. The aristocracy, insulated by land ownership and tax exemptions, partied on. The church and the state absorbed more and more of the nation's dwindling wealth. Spain entered a long, agonizing twilight of stagnation, depopulation, and irrelevance. They had all the money in the world, and they went broke. The incentive to produce had been replaced by the incentive to speculate and consume. The currency had lost its connection to reality. Just like the Spanish Empire, the British Empire fell into the trap of believing its own financial invincibility. But where Spain died of inflation and extraction, Britain died of exhaustion and debt. In 1914, Britain was the world's banker. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency, as good as gold, because it was backed by gold. Consols, the perpetual bonds of the British government, were considered the safest asset on earth. But the two world wars shattered the balance sheet. Britain spent its blood and its treasure to defeat Germany, but the financial cost was terminal. To finance the First World War, Britain liquidated its foreign investments and borrowed heavily from the United States. By 1919, the creditor had become the debtor. The pivotal mistake, the moment of hubris that sealed the decline, came in 1925. Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, decided to return Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war parity. He wanted the pound to look strong. He wanted to maintain the prestige of the empire, but the math did not support the price. The British economy had been ravaged by war. It was not as productive as it had been in 1913. By pegging the currency at an artificially high rate, Churchill decimated British exports. Coal, steel, and textiles became uncompetitive globally. The result was deflation, unemployment, and the general strike of 1926. The government chose the appearance of strength over the reality of solvency. They tried to defy the market. The market won. In 1931, Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard, effectively defaulting on its promise to redeem paper for metal. The pound floated and immediately collapsed in value, but the slide continued after World War II. Britain was technically bankrupt. It relied on American loans just to feed its population. The empire was dismantled, not just for moral reasons, but because London could no longer afford the garrisons. The 1950s and 60s were a slow bleed. Successive governments tried to maintain a welfare state and a global military presence on a shrinking economic base. They printed money to cover the difference. This led to the stop-go cycle of the 1960s brief booms, fueled by easy credit, followed by inflation, crises, and sudden austerity. In 1967, the government was forced to devalue the pound again. Prime Minister Harold Wilson famously went on television and told the British public that the pound in your pocket had not lost value. It was a lie. Imports became more expensive. The standard of living stagnated. The nadir arrived in 1976. Inflation in Britain hit 24%. The government was spending far beyond its means, subsidizing failing industries and expanding social programs. The bond markets finally revolted. Investors stopped buying British debt gilts. The pound went into freefall. In a moment of supreme national humiliation, Great Britain, the former ruler of the waves, had to go hat in hand to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. The conditions were harsh. Massive spending cuts, high interest rates, and structural reform. The winter of discontent followed in 1978 with trash piling up in Leicester Square and bodies left unburied due to gravedigger strikes. The British middle class was hollowed out. Those who had saved in cash saw their purchasing power vaporized. Those who owned land or had moved assets abroad survived. The lesson was clear. When a reserve currency dies, it does not happen overnight. It happens in a series of steps, each one denied by the politicians, until it is too late. Just like the British Empire, The Soviet Union faced a crisis of solvency, but it was hidden behind an iron curtain of totalitarian control. The Soviet collapse is often framed as a political event, but it was at its core a balance sheet event. By the 1970s, the Soviet command economy was rotting from the inside. Productivity was abysmal. The state set the prices of 24 million distinct goods, from steel beams to shoelaces. Without market signals, there was no way to know what was actually needed. Factories produced goods that no one wanted just to meet quotas, while basic necessities were in chronic shortage. The system was kept alive by one thing: oil. The high oil prices of the 1970s allowed the USSR to import grain from the West and subsidize its inefficient industries. It masked the structural rot. The Kremlin felt rich. They invaded Afghanistan. They expanded their military footprint. They maintained a vast welfare state where employment was guaranteed, even if the job was meaningless. Then the math changed. In the mid-1980s, the price of oil collapsed. Saudi Arabia opened the taps, and the Soviet revenue stream dried up almost overnight. At the same time, the gerontocracy in Moscow was printing rubles to pay wages, but because prices were fixed by the state, this inflation did not show up on price tags. It showed up in the form of shortages. This is what economists call repressed inflation. The official price of bread remained low, but there was no bread. The official price of a car was affordable, but the waiting list was 10 years long. Soviet citizens had pockets full of rubles, but nothing to buy. This was the ruble overhang, a massive accumulation of worthless currency with nowhere to go. When Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to reform the system with perestroika, he inadvertently pulled the plug on the life support. By allowing some market mechanisms, the repressed inflation exploded into the open. The government began to run massive deficits, financed by printing money. By 1990, the deficit was 10% of GDP. The distribution system collapsed. Regions began to hoard their own goods. The social contract, we pretend to work, and you pretend to pay us, shattered. In 1991, the Soviet Union did not just dissolve politically, it went bankrupt. The savings of the Soviet people were wiped out. In subsequent currency reforms, specifically the Pavlov Reform of 1991, the government effectively confiscated the cash holdings of the population to try and stabilize the system. It failed. Hyperinflation followed in the 1990s. A lifetime of work for a factory foreman in Volgograd was reduced to the price of a few bottles of vodka. The state assets were auctioned off to insiders, the oligarchs, for pennies on the dollar. The middle class, such as it was, became destitute. The mortality rate spiked. The collapse was total. It showed that no amount of police power, no amount of propaganda, and no amount of nuclear weapons can repeal the laws of economics. When the money dies, the society dies. The pattern repeats in 7 distinct stages. Stage 1 is sound money. A civilization begins with a currency of defined value, usually linked to a hard asset like gold or silver. There is low leverage. Government is small. The economy grows based on production savings and investment. This is the era of the honest ledger. Generations work hard, delay gratification, and build genuine capital. The culture values thrift and prudence. Stage 2 is overextension. As the society becomes wealthy, it becomes ambitious. It takes on obligations it cannot easily afford. This might be imperial expansion, as with Spain and Britain. It might be a massive social welfare state, as with the late Soviet Union or the modern West. The government begins to spend more than it takes in. Deficits appear, but they are dismissed as temporary or necessary for the greater good. Stage 3 is the turn. The government realizes it can no longer fund its ambitions through taxation alone. Raising taxes is politically unpopular, so it turns to the currency. In the Roman era, this meant clipping coins or mixing in base metals. In the modern era, it means central bank accommodation. The government begins to issue debt that the market would not naturally buy, and the central bank buys it. This is the beginning of financial repression. Interest rates are held artificially low to make the debt serviceable. the connection between money and value is severed. Stage 4 is inflation and inequality. The newly created money does not flow evenly. It flows first to the government and then the financial sector. This is the Cantillon effect. Those closest to the money printer get rich, those furthest away get inflation. Asset prices rise. Real estate stocks and luxury goods soar in value. The rich get richer not because they are more productive, but because they own assets that are inflating. The working class and the middle class who live on wages see their purchasing power erode. The cost of living rises faster than income. Social trust begins to fracture. People sense the game is rigged, even if they cannot articulate the mechanics. Stage 5 is the great redistribution. This is the stage of acceleration. Inflation moves from assets to consumer goods. The government, desperate to maintain control, becomes predatory. Capital controls are introduced, taxes are raised, regulations are tightened to prevent capital flight. The narrative shifts to blaming speculators, hoarders, or foreign enemies for the economic distress. Dissent is categorized as misinformation. The middle class is squeezed out of existence. This is the phase where the productive engine of the economy begins to seize up because the incentives are inverted. Stage 6 is loss of confidence. The critical psychological threshold is crossed. The public realizes that the government cannot honor its promises. They realize the currency is a melting ice cube. Panic sets in. There is a flight to hard assets, gold, land, foreign currencies, anything that the government cannot easily print or seize. Velocity of money accelerates. People spend the currency as soon as they get it, knowing it will be worth less tomorrow. Shortages appear. Supply chains break. Stage 7 is collapse and reset. The currency is abandoned. The economy reverts to barter or adopts a foreign currency. The existing political order is often swept away. A new system is established, usually after a period of chaotic transition. Wealth is wiped out for the holders of paper assets. While the holders of hard assets emerge as the new elite, the slate is wiped clean, usually at a devastating human cost. Just like Spain in the 16th century, just like Britain in the 1970s, and just like the USSR in the 1980s, the United States today is flashing the warning signs of advanced stage decay. Current data suggest we are firmly in stage 5. The arithmetic is unambiguous. The U.S. national debt is compounding at a rate that mathematically precludes repayment in constant dollars. The debt-to-GDP ratio has surpassed levels seen at the height of World War II. But unlike 1945, there is no peace dividend coming. There is no massive demographic boom of young workers. There is only the aging baby boomer generation requiring trillions in unfunded entitlements, Social Security, and Medicare. The Congressional Budget Office's own projections show interest on the debt becoming the single largest line item in the federal budget, eclipsing the military and social programs. We see the symptoms of stage 5 in the social fabric. The wealth gap is at levels not seen since the 1920s. This is not a failure of capitalism. It is a feature of fiat currency debasement. The asset holders, the top 10%, have seen their net worth skyrocket as the Federal Reserve pumped trillions into the financial system. The bottom 50% have seen their wages stagnate in real terms, while the cost of housing, food, and energy explodes. The American dream of home ownership is becoming a mathematical impossibility for the average worker. This mirrors the destruction of the Spanish middle class and the hollowing out of the British working class. The incentive structure is broken. Why save in dollars when the real interest rate is negative? The rational move under these constraints is to speculate. Hence, the rise of meme stocks, cryptocurrencies, and zero-day options. It is the behavior of a casino, not an economy. There is a counter-argument, of course. Many economists argue that the U.S. is different. They say the dollar is the world reserve currency, giving the U.S. an exorbitant privilege. They argue that because all other nations are also debasing their currencies, the dollar is the cleanest dirty shirt in the laundry. They point to the strength of the U.S. military and the depth of U.S. capital markets. This is true to a point. The U.S. can sustain the illusion longer than a developing nation like Venezuela or Zimbabwe. but the privilege is not infinite. In fact, the weaponization of the dollar through sanctions has accelerated the desire of rival nations to dollarize. The BRICS nations are actively building alternative settlement mechanisms. Central banks around the world are buying gold at a record pace. They are voting with their balance sheets. They know the history. They know that every reserve currency eventually fails. The Dutch guilder failed. The Spanish real failed. The British pound failed. To believe the dollar is exempt is to believe in a state of permanent exception to the laws of mathematics. There are three possible endgames. The first is controlled decline. This is the British path. The government manages the descent. Standard of living drops gradually. The currency loses value consistently, but not catastrophically. The nation accepts a reduced role on the world stage. Assets are slowly repriced. It is a soft landing into mediocrity. This requires political discipline that currently seems absent in Washington. The second is chaotic collapse. This is the Soviet path. The system is propped up by lies and printing until it hits a wall. A sudden shock, a war. A pandemic, a banking crisis exposes the insolvency. Confidence evaporates overnight. The currency hyperinflates or is redenominated. Supply chains fail. Civil unrest becomes the norm. The government loses the monopoly on violence. This is the scenario of maximum pain. The third is reset and restructure. This is the historical norm for the end of a long-term debt cycle. The government explicitly changes the rules. This could take the form of a debt jubilee, a return to a gold-backed currency at a much higher price, or the introduction of a central bank digital currency CBDC to lock down capital. In this scenario, the debt is wiped away or inflated away, but the freedom and privacy of the individual are often the price paid for stability. History suggests that when a state is backed into a corner, it will choose control over liberty every time the pattern is set. The stages are advancing. The arithmetic is in motion. The only variable is timing and pain. Subscribe to this channel. We will continue to track the data. We will continue to analyze the historical parallels. Do not rely on the official narrative. Educate yourself on monetary history. Build resilience in your personal economy. Pay attention to the flow of capital, not the flow of rhetoric. The storm is not coming. The storm is here.